Okay, so we're back. You notice my background has changed. I'm home now. So let's get back into the revolution. Last we were talking about the Tories. The Tories being the British sympathizers in the Americas. Here we go. Like I said, the Tories were never a majority. Estimates were between 1/5 and 1/3 of the population, but still sizable. It was actually more common for people to not really have a side. Anywhere between 1/3 and 2/5 didn't really have a side and didn't really, pick sides and was kind of okay with whoever won or okay with whoever lost, or kind of waiting to see how the chips fell, as it was. This campaign into Canada didn't really accomplish very much for the rebels. It was largely, a waste of time, a waste of resources, a waste of men. It did kind of shock the British, which I guess was the point, but strategically speaking, it didn't really have an effect. And this sort of moral victory, but strategic failure, was typical of the early American Revolution and the early defeats suffered by the rebels. So General Howe, who was another American general, launched a campaign in New York that showed the inexperience on the part of the American military. He tried to defeat the British in Brooklyn when they were landing at Garrison Beach, and this became known as the Battle of Long Island. It happened near what is now Prospect Park in Brooklyn, although some people place it closer to Greenwood Cemetery, but the two are actually fairly close to each other, so the battle could have actually spanned between the two places. The Battle of Long Island was an American defeat. Washington was very easily defeated. The Patriot troops are no match for the British soldiers, even though the British soldiers were landing in unfriendly territory under unfriendly conditions. Washington basically had to abandon the army and flee, and he crossed the Hudson into New Jersey. For Washington, there were later moral victories. As he moved from New Jersey to Pennsylvania, Howe abandoned the campaign, which made Washington the only leader, and he moved to winter in New York, which was still under rebel control, and he left some troops at Trenton. So Washington decided to attack the Hessian troops, which were stationed near Trenton, and was having trouble crossing due to the ice-clogged Delaware River. And finally, on Christmas night, he was able to cross with what was left of his army from New York and New Jersey. The Battle of Trenton was started by this crossing of the Delaware River. Washington with 2,400 men. They marched for 9 miles in a sleet and snowstorm, much like tonight perhaps, and the Hessians were taken by surprise, largely because they weren't expecting an attack on Christmas Eve in the middle of a snowstorm. 900 of the Hessians surrendered, some fled. This was a moral victory, although again, this, not a strategic victory, because it didn't lead to the recovery of any territory. All it did was led to the relieving of Trenton and the freeing of the troops that Washington and Howe had left there. So it was no strategic victory, and a few days later, Washington outmaneuvered Cornwallis, another British general, at Princeton. Again, an important moral victory, but not a strategic victory, since it was the middle of the winter and the territory couldn't be occupied. This Battle of Trenton, however, is the first real American victory of the Revolution. And this is, of course, the famous image of Washington crossing the Delaware. This is Washington with the flag, which is probably inaccurate, crossing with his generals. This this ice floe, pushing the ice out of the way. And you can see in the back, they were actually mounted. They had to bring their horses with them. Each boat had one horse, made for a little bit less than 100 total mounted men, but still, it was an advantage the Hessians didn't have. The Hessians fled from this defeat, and many of them ended up in what we in New York City think of as upstate New York, but really like the Hudson Valley area, because it's not very far. And some of them would terrorize the local population. And actually, the later myth of the Headless Horseman is that he was a Hessian mercenary who fled to the Hudson Valley after this defeat at the Battle of Trenton, and then terrorized the town of Sleepy Hollow in his afterlife. The Battle of Saratoga was another battle meant to sort of cut off the British. The British rather were advancing to try to cut off the Americans. But Washington saw in this a chance for victory. General Burgoyne, who was the British general, had this master plan to come down from Canada toward the Hudson toward Albany to cut off the U.S. troops at Oswego, and the U.S. troops there, were undermanned and had to retreat. But Washington, who was still stationed in New Jersey, had about 5,000 troops, and Washington realized that if he won this victory, it wouldn't necessarily be that strategic, but it would be a moral victory, and this moral victory might bring all of New England, which was previously sort of a hotbed for British loyalists, into the war. So Burgoyne had about 650 loyalists. Remember, again, the loyalists were a small part of the army, and about 500 Indians who were sort of allied troops willing to fight the British, and about 6,000 regular British soldiers. He captured Fort Ticonderoga, and General Arnold at the same time drove Burgoyne from Oswego sort of in his rear. This was kind of a guerrilla action, showing the American tactic for guerrilla warfare. Burgoyne largely ignored it. Perhaps he was unaware of it. And Burgoyne continued to move south to meet Washington, who was moving north to battle at Saratoga. Howe was supposed to reinforce Burgoyne, but he didn't. So this Battle of Saratoga could have turned out very differently if Howe had managed to get there with his soldiers. Burgoyne was forced to surrender, and of the about 7,500 troops the British had, including Indians and Loyalists, about 5,700 were captured and marched off to captivity in Virginia. These are just some maps of the battle, which I'm not really going to dwell on, but you should at least be aware. The British were moving down from Canada. They captured Oswego, which is somewhere up here. I didn't mark it on the map, which was stupid. No, I didn't mark it on the map, which is stupid of me. And Washington was moving north from New Jersey to meet him, and that's where they met, was Fort Ticonderoga. The French were sort of unexpected allies of the Americans. The French were still angry after the defeat of the 7 Years' War. They were angry at the British. They saw this as a chance to get revenge on the British. They'd rebuilt their navy since the 7 Years' War, realizing that a large part of why they lost was naval insuperiority. And they enacted the old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It wasn't that the British, the French were particularly sympathetic to the Americans. They thought that helping the Americans would weaken the British. Louis XVI himself, dealing with serious debt issues, sent money to the fledgling U.S. to help their war effort. After their victory at Saratoga, this sort of second major American victory of the war, Louis XVI became the first monarch, or the first head of state, to recognize America as a separate country. Benjamin Franklin, who was in Paris sort of trying to convince the French to aid the Americans, convinced Louis to do this and convinced them to draft a formal alliance treaty. This was really the turning point of the Revolutionary War, because now the rebels were not this sort of hopelessly undermanned guerrilla war force. Now they had the backing of a major European power. Meanwhile, things weren't going great for the Americans. They'd lost the Battle of Philadelphia and forced to abandon it, and Washington had to retreat and winter at Valley Forge, about 20 miles north of Philadelphia. The Army's supply lines collapsed, and a lot of the soldiers were hungry and starving. This was also the first time that the French soldiers managed to reach their American allies, led by the Marquis de Lafayette. If you're ever on a street named Lafayette, you know, in Brooklyn there's a Lafayette Street which runs through downtown and most of sort of northeast Brooklyn. I believe there's a Lafayette Avenue in Newark as well. It's named after the Marquis de Lafayette. So the Marquis de Lafayette was the French general who was sent over to lead the French troops who were allied to the Americans. And he has the unfortunate effect to meet Washington at Valley Forge. While he writes in his journal, the unfortunate soldiers had neither coats nor hats nor shirts nor shoes. And a lot of them were suffering from frostbite. But Washington cemented his position as a leader of the people at Valley Forge because he was there with his soldiers, going through the same hardship as them. You know, there's a famous story about how he came across a bunch of soldiers and they were cooking something over the fire, and it was potato, and they offered him the potato, and he refused and told them it was for them to eat, not for him. And this seems like a really, you know, kind of stupid story, like who cares about a potato? But you know, a potato was how a lot of the armies would feed themselves on the march. A potato keeps fairly well. It's easy to cook. It provides a lot of calories and nutrients. A lot of these pre-modern armies, the potato was their main form of sustenance. And the fact that Washington refused to take their food from them showed them that Washington was their leader. So although this was a rough time for Washington and his troops, it enabled him to position himself as sort of the military leader of the people. This is Washington at Valley Forge. In the spring, however, the Americans began to have an advantage. With the spring coming, they could resupply. Most of the supplies brought to them by the French, and the French alliance meant that French troops and French ships were beginning to arrive. The British sensed the movement away from them, the strategic advantage moving away from them, once the Americans were able to resupply. And they changed their strategies, using sea power to try to seize American ports and disrupt American shipping. So Savannah and Charleston in South Carolina were captured as a part of this. You see here, British victories here. But it's Savannah and Charleston. No, you can't see Charleston because it's off the map. Let me bring it back. Okay. Well, forget it. Charleston's here, and Savannah is a bit south of it. You can't see because of the way the... Oh, maybe you can. Here you go. Fine. You can see down here. There was also... This is the only real time you have the Tories actually fighting pitched battles against the Patriots in South Carolina, using guerrilla tactics. The Spanish, meanwhile, entered the war on the American side, capturing the Gulf cities, the cities in Florida, and the cities down in Georgia for the Americans. Cornwallis realized the Southern strategy had largely failed, and Benedict, he was joined by an American traitor, Benedict Arnold. He planned to betray the American fortress at West Point, and his plot was foiled, so he switched sides. Major John Andre was caught after meeting with Arnold, and largely because he refused to wear civilian clothes. Benedict Arnold was seen as a spy, seen as cavorting with the British, and hanged. And this is the hanging of